Today I want us to look at the only other two translations that say, and the word was a God, on the Jehovah's Witness website. If you go to jw.org, the Jehovah's Witness website, they'll mention a couple other translations that also translate John 1:1 in this way, that also translate it as, and the word was a God. All right, so let's go ahead and look at these two translations now. Okay, so the first one is under the heading, John 1:1 explained, in the beginning was the Word. But as you can see here in the New World Translation, they say, and the Word was a God, lowercase g, because they believe and teach that Jesus was the first of God's creation, and that through Jesus, everything else was created. Let's just look at some interesting things when it comes to this translation of, and the Word was a God, which makes Jesus a created being, not the eternal logos, but I guess a finite logos, even though a finite logos was not anything that was taught in the first century, but nevertheless, that's what is believed today by these groups and organizations. Okay, so here at the bottom of this article, we have all of these translations, but these all mention the word being divine. Okay, I'll make another video eventually that delves into that in depth. But we do have this guy right here that does say, lo and behold, and the word was a God. Okay, so we have this as one of the two examples that can be cited as a translation that matches their translation, the New World Translation, and also says, and the word was a God, lowercase g. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about this. We see right here what this Bible version is from, that they're quoting this from. It's called the New Testament in an improved version, the 1808 edition by Thomas Belsham, and says it is based on a New Testament translation by William Newcome. Huh. Okay. All right, so who are these guys? And why is there a translation based on some other guy's translation? Like, what is going on here? All right, let's go ahead and talk about this, because this is actually kind of a funny story. This is actually pretty interesting. All right, so who's this William Newcome guy? All right, well, William Newcome is this guy right here, and he published his translation in 1796. So you had the 1796 translation. All right, well, William Newcome, he was an Anglican archbishop scholar who created his translation based on new manuscripts, which had broken away from the Textus Receptus. He's trying to produce a more trustworthy translation, so good for him. All right, so he does so by making his 1796 translation. Okay, now after William Newcome dies, there's another guy who comes along named Thomas Belsham. All right, so Thomas Belsham is this guy right here, and instead of starting from scratch and making his own, he just takes Newcome's translation and just starts making changes to it, just starts adding to it. He's actually a Unitarian, by the way. So he gets together a Unitarian committee. They create their own 1808 translation. All right, so why did they take Newcome's Bible? Well, maybe one, because they were lazy. Number two, it said that they wanted to attach themselves to Newcome's scholarly reputation, right? So he has a good reputation. He's well-liked in the community. He's breaking away from the Textus Receptus. He's using more updated manuscripts. He's wanting to produce a much more authentic translation, okay? So this guy is going to piggyback off of this reputation, and he's going to insert his own changes. All right, so what is one of the changes that Belsham makes with his new translation? Well, obviously, it's no surprise, being that he's a Unitarian, he's going to fudge with John 1:1. All right, so this graphic right here shows Belsham's changed translation, which says, the Word was in the beginning, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. All right, so you can see right here, he changed it to, and the Word was a God. However, what's interesting is he has this little footnote indicator here, and then when we go down to the footnote, it says, it gives his translation, but then it shows what the original translation was from Newcome, which said, was God. Not was a God, but just was God. He's openly admitting in his footnote that he changed and messed with the original translation that he co-opted from Newcome. So we see that apart from the New World Translation, one of the other two translations that uses the indefinite article and says, and the word was a God, It's really just from some Unitarian guy who borrowed someone else's hard work and borrowed their translation, just went in with his own committee, made the changes that he wanted to make, and then published it. All right, so this is not really a legit translation. All right, so now let's look at the second translation that's mentioned on the Jehovah's Witness website to where an indefinite article is used in John 1:1 that says, and the word was a God. All right, the other example is when you search for the Sahidic Coptic. All right, so it talks about it in this article here, was the word God or a God. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what it does mention here in summary is the Sahidic Coptic text is especially interesting for two reasons. First, as indicated above, it reflects an understanding of Scripture dating from before the 4th century, which was when the Trinity became official doctrine. And then it says, second, Coptic grammar is relatively close to English grammar in one important aspect. The earliest translations of the Christian Greek scriptures were into Syriac, Latin, and Coptic. Syriac and Latin, like the Greek of those days, do not have indefinite articles. Coptic, however, does. Moreover, scholar Thomas O. Lambden, in his work, Introduction to Sahidic Coptic, says, the use of the Coptic articles, both definite and indefinite, corresponds closely to the use of articles in English. All right, so it's like, yeah, in Koine Greek, in ancient Greek, there was no indefinite article. Like you would not say that there is a man. You could use a definite article and say there's the man, referring to the specific man, but you would not say that there is a man. The articles of like a did not come until much later in Greek, but in ancient Koine Greek, they didn't have articles like referring to like a man or a bird. They would just simply not have the article, and it would just be implicit that it was there. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the Sahidic Coptic here, and let's see specifically what it is they're referring to. All right, so here's the Sahidic Coptic right here. All right, and so then this right here would be the indefinite article a. So this is saying, and a God was the Logos. All right, so here we have it translated into English, and a God was the Logos, or and a God was the Word. Looking at the Sahidic Coptic here, we do have to deal with this indefinite article a. But what does this indefinite article here indicate, though, in the Sahidic Coptic? Is it trying to convey to us that God is simply like a common noun or a count noun, that it can be counted, as if he's one God among many other gods? All right, so what the Jehovah's Witness website actually leaves out and does not explain about the Sahidic Coptic is that actually the Sahidic Coptic uses the indefinite article for qualitative reasons. And by qualitative, I mean that it's conveying the nature or the essence and the character of something, not necessarily just counting it or referring to it as a common noun and saying it's one among many. All right, so here we have an example with John 4:24 that says in the English, God is spirit. All right, but is it saying God is a spirit? No, it's saying God is spirit in his essence, in his nature. All right, so if we were to translate the Sahidic Coptic directly word for word in English, it would say a spirit is God. All right, so is this calling God a spirit as if he's like one spirit among many other spirits, as if it's countable? No, not at all. It's qualitative. It's saying that God is spirit in his essence and his nature. We see the exact same thing with 1 John 1:5. A light is. English translation would be, for God a light is. Again, is it saying that God is one of many other lights? No. It uses this indefinite article a here, and it prefixes it to the predicate noun here because it's conveying the qualitative nature of it, saying that God is light in his essence and nature. He is light. Also, 1 John 4:8, God is the love. Now, this one's actually a little more interesting because it actually, instead of using the indefinite article, it actually uses a definite article when it wants to convey something being qualitative, probably because love here is actually a far more abstract concept than either spirit or light is. Because technically you can actually have multiple spirits and you can actually have multiple lights. But love is actually such an abstract concept that you can't actually have like multiple loves. All right, so again, if we were to translate this directly into English word for word, it would say God is the love. Now, obviously in English, that wouldn't make any sense. We would never say something like God is the love. But why does the Sahidic Coptic use articles in this way, prefixed to the predicate noun? Because it's describing the quality, the nature, the essence, and the character of the subject. So then we know that God in his essence, in his nature, eternally is love. Amen. All right, so now when it comes to John 1:1c with the Sahidic Coptic, it's no different. And a God was, past tense, the Logos. All right, so when we translate this into English, it would read as, and a God was the Word. However, just as we went over, again, when you have the indefinite article prefixed to the predicate, it's describing the quality of something. Here, it's describing the eternal essence and nature and character of the Word, or the Logos. Now, if we could, or were allowed to break annoying English grammar rules for a minute, and we just said, hey, forget English syntax and grammar, we're just going to pretend that English is just like Greek. And if I said, and God was the Word, and break the stupid English syntax rules for a second, and just let your hair down and just read it this way, you can actually feel it conveying the qualitative aspect in this more word-for-word translation. Say it with me. And God was the Word. And God was the Word. You can just feel the nature and the essence of God spilling over onto the subject of the Word when you read it that way in English. English is annoying with these things and limited in these ways. Every language has its differences. This is one of the challenges of translation. However, if we were to convey a more meaningful translation, we would add extra words into the translation, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. People get all up in arms when it's like when you try to convey the meaning in a language. Well, that doesn't mean that you're actually adding to the text necessarily. It just means that the language that you're translating into can sometimes just have limitations. And so to work around those limitations, you want to convey what the original language is actually saying, you're going to need to add a couple more words to help convey the original meaning. So if we were to actually convey the meaning, it would be something like, what God was, the Word was. Or, the Word had the same nature as God. All right, and so you should be able to see a little bit better now what's going on here with the differences in these translations. So the New World Translation broke away from the common translation of, and the Word was God, and changed it to, and the Word was a God. And then when you go to jw.org to look at their explanation and their justification for changing it to, and the Word was a God, when it comes to John 1:1, we see it only offers two other translations. One being a translation that was just from a Unitarian committee that simply had just co-opted someone else's translation and just fudged with it and changed it. And then the only other example that they give on their website is the Sahidic Coptic translation, which goes back to the 4th century. However, when we look closer, it's actually conveying something being qualitative. All right, that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, help me grow my channel, help get this content and information out there to people if you believe that it is helpful. And speaking of the Logos, John 1 says that the Logos was light who came and dwelt amongst us. May the light of the Logos shine in your mind, your heart, and your life so that you can know Christ and be a light for Christ to others. Pray that this channel can be a light of Christ for others. Thank you guys so much for watching. God bless you and take care.